Tonight, and to introduce our speaker this evening, Mr. Stewart Udall, we have with us Nick Spitzer. Many of you who may not think that you know Nick Spitzer do, because I'm sure that you have heard his programs, commentaries, and other works on NPR, PBS, the Discovery Channel, and lots of other locations, worked with the Smithsonian and others. Nick is an anthropologist and a folklorist, and who started his career in radio in college at Penn in Philadelphia a few years ago. He has continued working in the medium of radio and along with other media, and continues to develop work and research on music, on folklore, on links between Creole societies, Zydeco culture, and other unique aspects of Southern culture. Nick holds also a doctorate in anthropology from the University of Texas and worked for many years in Austin, and sort of pioneered a lot of early radio work and things that was happening in Austin a number of years ago. And he is with us constantly in New Orleans as a professor of folklore and cultural conservation at the University of New Orleans. We're fortunate enough to have been able to lure him to Tulane this year as the Mellon Professor in the Humanities. And I'd like you to welcome Nick Spitzer, who will introduce our speaker this evening. Nick.
Thank you so much. Great to be here this evening. Good to see all these faces in the room. It looks terrific from up here. And I hope the stragglers will continue. In the church I used to go to when I was a kid back in Connecticut, we always used to say, "Seats down front here." I think I was so that the preacher could keep an eye on who was giving what on the collection plate, though, more than anything, probably. No collection this evening, though. However, I do want to pay a few dues back. First, of course, I want to thank Dean Filson and his wife Leah for hosting us in recent days and for helping make this possible. Also really want to thank Tom Reese from the Stone Center for Latin American Studies for, can a guy midwife things? I think he can. He's been doing it. He brings a tremendous sensibility to making things happen here, and I appreciate that, Tom. And Carol Reese, who's on the architecture faculty, who's been behind this event all the way, and helping us put it together with the Center for Deep South Humanities. And I'm not sure if Randy is here this evening. Professor Sparks wasn't feeling well, but I'll thank him in absentia if he's not here this evening. And I also especially want to thank Shauna Walton, who's been putting things together for us, and Rachelle Starr, who's out front and will be actually vending this book, but she's been doing so much more to make everything go smoothly. Things take a lot of hands here, and the hands have come together to make this happen, and I'm just ecstatic that we're going to be able to do this evening. Oh yeah, let me also thank Ana Lopez from she's the Associate Provost, the Dynamo of Energy, a kind of a native Creolist herself who puts all the departments and programs of the university together, and our Provost, Lester Lefton. All of these folks have made a lot of good things happen. And I think it's appropriate for Stewart Udall to have a lot of different hands in the mix, because he's that kind of person who bridges realms. He's the kind of person where poetry and public policy have come together. Literally, he's written poetry, and he has cared about the arts, whether in Washington or back in perhaps the less provincial capital of Santa Fe, where he now lives. He is a man who has stood at the nexus of issues surrounding the preservation and presentation of nature and culture. He's somebody that is comfortable on the Indian reservation, but he's also comfortable in the halls of Congress. And I could, give you the standard biography, and it's an amazing and fascinating one. A number of years in the Congress from Arizona, 6 before he became John F. Kennedy's Secretary of the Interior, continued on after Kennedy's passing to become Johnson's Secretary of the Interior. He doesn't tell you, though, in that biography necessarily about his Mormon mission to New York in the 40s, when he said he saw every Broadway play and read every first edition novel. I don't think the elders back in Salt Lake had that in mind, but Stewart was an outreaching kind of person. He doesn't tell you that he played on a national invitational tournament basketball team in Madison Square Garden right after World War II. That's back in the days when the NIT meant a whole lot more than the NCAA, and Stewart was out there on the court playing basketball for the University of Arizona. You know, I can tell you that he got knighted by the King of Spain. That's impressive. It's a beautiful thing. In New Orleans, you know, everyone's a king, so, you know. But there are more impressive things about Stewart than just the fact that he helped add 40% more to our national parklands, helped bring us the national seashores, helped pass the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, helped pass the Wilderness Act. I mean, there are a lot of very impressive things like that. But I think the really impressive thing to me about Stewart, and one of the things I value about him so much, is that he grew up in a small town, and he never forgot that. He's from a small town in eastern Arizona on the border with New Mexico called St. John's. It's on the Colorado Plateau. It's a town of about 1,500. It's not a whole lot bigger now. And he comes to us out of a small community of ranchers and farmers. They were Mormons. They were Native American. They're Anglo-American, English, non-Mormon folk. They were Spanish people. And it's in this ranching community in a family of 6 that he grew up, where Mo would cut his hair and he would cut Mo's hair. Who's Mo? Mo is Morris Udall, his great late brother who ran for president in 1976 when was also a distinguished congressman. But Stewart is really molded and shaped in this family experience. And you may wonder, why is a humanities lecture series like ours on the Mellon side conjoining with the world of architecture? It's because Stewart is somebody who, in the title of our series, has learned the vernacular. That is, he grew up in a vernacular cultural setting, and some of the greatest lessons in his life were those lessons of sharing and taking care of the environment and getting along with people that were culturally different. And he has applied those lessons throughout his life. He learned the vernacular extremely well. He embodies that place where the humanities and human ecology come together. And that's a place we all need to keep in mind in the work we do, whether we're doing research or public policy or poetry, or all 3 or more of those things. He is someone who is able to embody those things. So when he got to Washington and began to bring out people like Robert Frost to Kennedy's inauguration, and Carl Sandburg, and doing things like with his wife Lee, his late beloved wife Lee, was able to resuscitate the galleries at the Department of the Interior that for years had held Indian artifacts are now being used for storage. He started referring to himself as the Secretary of Things in General. I like that. Things in general. He's also somebody that I respect greatly because he has a sort of a stubborn streak. He sticks to things no matter what. And I can sort of relate to that, and you, those of you who know me probably relate to that as well. After he was out of office, he was appointed for a year at Yale as an adjunct professor of environmental humanism, and he said, "I don't know what that means." But you know what? He knows how to do environmental humanism. He's a doer. That's one of the great things about Stewart. And again, that practice, that public practice of doing things is the great thing. But one of the greatest quotes of all I've read about Stewart recently, and it's from the poet Louis Untermeyer, who's one of the people that he gave voice to in this fluorescent period in the 60s when the National Endowment for the Arts was being formed, and when the Kennedy administration was in high cotton and so many cultural things were unfolding. He said, "No one I met in Washington was more culturally alert and more concerned about the human condition than Stewart Udall, Secretary of the Interior, a stubborn, incorruptible, in a corrupt world. If I ever feared that our relentless progress had prevented a real dedication to the land and the people who often do not deserve it, Udall restored my faith." Stewart has remained active. The Quiet Crisis is one of the great books in the environmental continuum of books, up there with Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold, right up there with The Quiet Crisis by Rachel Carson. And yet he's continued to write about the problems of the proliferation of atomic research into the nuclear weapons in the Mists of August. More recently, just a few years ago, this book, The Forgotten Founders, about the domestic West, about the people who pioneered and made the West, not the gunslingers and the miners, but the folks who really made things happen. Stewart has continued to write and to act, and he's here this evening as a hero, a colleague, and a friend of ours. Make him welcome, Stewart Udall.
Well, I'll do my best, Nick. Nick asked me what I wanted to talk about several weeks ago, and I said, well, you decide, and he gave me a rambling title, and I'm going to ramble. I would ramble anyway, Nick, that's my nature, and old men are entitled to range over various things and pretend we're wiser than you are. And I'm also going to surprise you maybe. This is, Dean, the right venue for me, holistic planning. You're going to hear some things you probably didn't expect before I get through this evening. But I come from a state, one of my brother's jokes was, and he had several instances to point to, beginning with Barry Goldwater, that Arizona was the only state where a child could not be told they could grow up to be president of the United States. And one of the reasons for that, I guess, is Arizona straight talk. If there ever was a straight talker that ran for president, it was Barry Goldwater. And then John McCain and my brother and others. So I'm going to begin with my straight talk story, just sort of to enliven your spirits here. This is a true story, political story. People never understood in Arizona that my brother and I and Barry Goldwater had a relationship unknown in Washington today, where friendship was more important than politics. And when President Ronald Reagan, 20 years ago or so, nominated the first woman to go on the Supreme Court, it was Sandra Day O'Connor, from a ranch family in Arizona, a judge, to go on the Supreme Court. The Reverend Jerry Falwell, about the second day after the name went up, held a press conference, and he announced that this was a bad woman. She had voted wrong on an abortion bill in the legislature, and worse than that, like Senator Goldwater's wife, she had been president of a subversive organization called Planned Parenthood in Phoenix. And he said he was sure that if every good Christian would write or wire President Reagan, he would withdraw this offensive name. Well, that was something. The reporters rushed over to Senator Goldwater's office and told him. He said, what? Falwell said that? Now, as the straight talk, he said, every good Christian should line up and kick Falwell's ass. That's what he said, and of course he meant it. He was furious. My brother in his office saw it was front page the next day, what Goldwater had said, and he scribbled a note and had it hand-delivered to Barry, and it said, Barry, it's a terrific idea, but it won't work. Falwell's a good Christian, he'll turn the other cheek. So that's Arizona straight talk, and you're going to get some straight talk from me. I'm too old, Nick, for anything but, in my own views, straight talk. This is kind of a sentimental journey for me. I'm not making many trips. I have a handicap. I can't make notes for speeches, but my friends tell me I'm giving better speeches just talking. Just let it flow. Just let it flow, they say. And this has been an opportunity to come to this truly extraordinary area. And Santa Fe, New Mexico, northern New Mexico, and New Orleans have some important differences, but a lot of similarities. The one difference I'll make is my home in Santa Fe is at 7,400 feet. And I can see mountains 50 miles away, and it's a wonderful place to be. And the thing about Santa Fe that is so extraordinary, I mean, I did a book called To the Inland Empire. It's been reissued by the Museum of New Mexico about the Coronado expedition, 1540, that first explored inland in the United States, and that was a wonderful experience for me, because I had to study the history of my own region. And New Mexico was settled in 1598. I kept asking Nick and other people, when did the first settlers, European settlers, come to New Orleans? And they say 1700 or around about there. Well, we're ahead of you by quite a ways. And this has meant that what northern New Mexico has is a different kind of a mix, but a wonderful mix of people that you have here. These early Spanish families are still there. We have distinctive architecture like New Orleans. We have a mix of native people, some of the most wonderful native people in the country. The Pueblo Indians are right in the middle of things. And we have now Anglos and Coyotes, if you know what that is. That's the mixture. Well, you have words to cover. The mixture of people. And this makes for a rich culture, a rich civilization, a rich interaction of people. And I thought about it when I came here. I knew Hale Boggs, the congressman. He's been gone a long time. And I sat with Lindy last night, and I learned something that I didn't know. Louisiana, because of the cultural mix and because of the tolerance that fostered and developed, it didn't have George Wallace or Strom Thurmond or these other idiots in Mississippi and so on who stand in the door. We're never going to do anything. And one of the reasons was that New Orleans had a congressman, Hale Boggs. He was on the path to leadership. He would have been speaker if he hadn't been killed in a plane accident. And and Lindy told me last night that when the Civil Rights Bill came to the floor in the House, he was in the House of Representatives, that the night before his children were all telling him, he said he was going to vote for civil rights, one of the few Southerners. And they said, no, you've got to give a speech. And he had decided not to give a speech. He said he didn't think he was. Well, the next day on the floor, he gave a speech. And I want to go back and read it because it sent out a note that there were Southerners who felt that people could live together and be tolerant and so on. And you have here not only a rich cultural mix. I read the other day a cultural historian who said, I disagree with half of it. He said the most important American cultural contributions to the world, jazz and Western films. Well, my book is against the idea that the West was a violent place, and that's what Western films created, a distorted view and a mythology about that. But this is the home, and it's still alive and well, thanks to all of you, of this wonderful cultural contribution that is not just to the United States, but to the world. And so I'm paying my compliments, Nick, as you would expect, to this community and to Louisiana and to the spirit that is here, because I not only compare it favorably with New Mexico, where I live, it's a matter of wonder to me that this has happened. And one thing I didn't put in my book, I don't know why, I couldn't find a place to logically fit it, because you had that spirit in the West. The violence, the little violence, got all the publicity. You know, the most violent state in the 19th century, South Carolina, the number of lynchings. I mean, there's no comparison. But the fact of the matter is that out in the West, the community, the settlers that went out later, the ones that went early and the ones that went later, and the native people themselves, the community was more important than the individual. We've gone in this country down a different road, haven't we now, with all this individualism and so on. Part of my speech tonight is that we better consider turning back to where we think the future and the community are more important than the individualism and displays of individualism and so on, because this is very important. But in the West, I'm talking about in the early years of the last century, there were 3 Western states who elected Jewish governors 50 years before New York. Just absorb that for a moment. Why? Because they judged people not by their religion or skin color or other things. They judged people by what kind of a man is this person in the community. The man in Utah who was elected, Mormon state, overwhelmingly elected governor, what did he do? He built the best trolley system at that time in the country, and he contributed a lot to the community. He wasn't selfish like the billionaires of today who hoard their wealth and look down upon all the rest of us and so on. So I make that point because I have become a great believer that this comes out of my conservation education, my conservation belief, that a generation does best when it sets out to make a contribution, a legacy to future generations. We have a problem here. I'm going to roll right ahead. The idea, you don't hear much talk about future generations. In the 1960s and thereafter, Republicans, Democrats, both were proud of the fact that we were doing things, a wilderness bill, the Wild Rivers bill, national seashores. We did 14 of them around the country and so on, new national parks and all the rest of that. Why were we doing it? We were doing it because we felt we had a duty to pass on a better, more spacious world, a world where outdoor recreation was possible to future generations. That was the philosophy. You don't hear it much today, I'm afraid, and I'm going to come back to that later on, because the conservation movement, which is dormant in this country today, I regret to say, I regret deeply to say it, the conservation movement was born in this country. Republican President Theodore Roosevelt. The word conservation in 1900 did not mean or have the connotations that it had soon thereafter. and has today. We were the world leader in creating national parks, in setting up national forests and managing them on a scientific basis. We were the leader in protecting the heritage of this country, the cultural heritage, the heritage of historic places and so on. We were the leader. And we had a second round of leadership under President Franklin Roosevelt, a Democrat. It was all bipartisan in those days. You didn't have arguments. Everything is controversial today. This is pretty sick. And then along in the 1960s, when we came along, for 20 years, we got up such a momentum. The people did, not just some of us in Washington. There was a great upsurge of conservation sentiment. People were beating on my door. I wasn't out being a hero there saying, hey, here's a project. We, as you may have seen in the paper today, I talked about that yesterday, we beat the Port of New York Authority. They wanted to set up an airport in the Great Swamp of New Jersey. The people rallied round. Some of my people said, well, these people that live next to the Great Swamp of New Jersey are mostly wealthy Republicans. And I said, what does that have to do with it? Is it good for the country? That's the test. And that was the test throughout the 1960s. Is this something that will benefit future generations? Is this something that is good for the country? And then we had that wonderful book by Rachel Carson, Silent Spring. Most important book, I believe, for environmental thought and humanistic thought in the last century. Silent Spring. And she said that if we didn't understand the side effects of what we were doing, that we would make great mistakes and we would tear at the fabric of life. And her book, published in 32 languages, international bestseller, is still influential out in the world. A woman who's a biologist, but a beautiful writer, a wonderful writer. And that began to change things, and we began to think holistically in terms of the total environment. That's one of the things I wanted to remind you of tonight, that was a legacy of this woman and of the type of thinking that began. And I began being popular with architects, city planners, and others because we were saying, as you're doing at this school, you have to work together in a synergistic way if you're going to do the right kind of planning and if you're going to plan for the future. This country has been at its best when it thought holistically and thought scientifically. You know, the great secret of America, people talk about science and technology as though that's something separate out here. And some people today, when you hear me in a few minutes get to my main topic, say, well, technology will save us. There's a technological, we'll run out of oil, there's a technological solution. The great strength of the United States and the reason we're I'll say, a world leader is that we had an educational system that gave everyone, or most of us, an opportunity to achieve. And why did we win the Nobel Prize in science and the other chemistry and everything else? Because of our educational system. It wasn't just that people popped up. We provided, beginning at the end of the Great War that I was part of, the famous GI Bill, that soldiers who came back, and then that spread and so on, that people could get an education and could make a contribution. And that's the great strength. That's the great strength of our country. It has been, and it is today. But we face some big problems, and we're ducking them. We're ducking them. There are two of them. The first big problem that we confront is under the heading of global warming. They don't want to discuss it in Washington, this current administration. They say, well, there's a little climate change going on. A little climate change? Oh boy. Listen to the scientists, read the reports. There was a report last week that Swiss scientists had studied and concluded that last year in Europe was the hottest in history. Matter of fact, 19,000 people died in the heat waves that they have. The evidence is piling up, except most of the people in Washington choose to look the other way or pretend that it isn't serious. The reports by scientists are coming in all the time. There's one last week or 2 weeks ago that indicated scientists at the University of Washington have been studying Western meteorology and precipitation. We had in New Mexico the second hottest summer in history, as one example. In the West, we don't have your type of precipitation that just falls when you want it and when you don't want it. This is the arid part of the country, the Arid West. And if, as some of the scientists are beginning to tell us, if the yield of the rivers, because the yield comes out of the snowpack in the high mountains, drops, there's not enough water for these big metropolises. You know, Phoenix, ignoring all the rules of planning and architecture, is trying to be another Los Angeles and succeeding. They're tearing up the desert. Las Vegas, Nevada is trying to be Phoenix, and so is Denver, and on they go. But they're dependent on water. And if this isn't a cyclical drought, as most people want to believe, where I live in New Mexico, well, this is another drought and it'll go away. If it is related to global warming, where are we headed? And this is not a United States problem, it's global warming. And we better start to pay attention. And it's related to the burning of fossil fuels and the creation of what is called greenhouse gases. If you're not following this issue, I beg you, follow it, study it, get to know about it. Somehow or other, we've got to get some statesmanship in our country and abroad in addressing this issue. My son, the congressman, has told me he went to a briefing a few weeks ago, and scientists were saying at the rate the glaciers and the ice caps are melting, the habitat of the polar bear will be gone in 50 years. Of course, what that does to the oceans and the level of the oceans and to the vulnerable areas in this part of the world. I mean, we can shrug it off and say, well, it just looks like it's a little climate change and so on, and it will turn back. I believe that would be enormously disastrous for the future. We need vision. The old biblical expression, where there is no vision, the people perish. We ought to begin to pay attention, because if in fact, and the evidence is there, the nation that has to lead and is turning its back today, the only nation that can lead is the United States of America. We're 4% of the people on this planet, and we produce 25% of the global warming of the greenhouse gases. And our automobile culture is a runaway. You know more about that than I do. All you have to do is look around you. And I saw the other day, China has increased its oil imports last year 30%. They want to have automobiles. Where is this headed? Where is petroleum headed? The United States production of crude oil, that was my job to study it and do something. We didn't have an energy policy, I just studied it. And it peaked, our production of crude oil peaked in 1970. It's been going down ever since. Oh, the continental shelf has helped. The largest oil field ever discovered in the United States of America, Prudhoe Bay in Alaska, started production in 1977? It's going down. It's going down. And this has the potential. These two things are coming together, in my opinion, to create a climate, to produce events, to produce shortages that are going to affect the lives of everyone here in the room, except the old gray-head people like myself. We won't be around. But I'm telling you, for the sake of yourself and your children and your grandchildren, it's time that we paid attention. And all you have to do is to look at the Louisiana Oil Industry. What's happened with its production? Even with the offshore continental shelf, of course, that's USA, supposedly. There we are. But more oil will be discovered. Again, this kind of wishful thinking that I was describing, where global warming is concerned. Most of the petroleum geologists that I listen to and talk to believe that, well, some were saying 2005. Maybe it'll be a few years later, maybe it'll be 10 years later. So what? That world production will peak. And when that happens, and world production goes down, and the shortages appear, and it goes down, what will happen to this automobile culture, for example, that we are so proud of in this country, and that provides, yes, sure, wonderful freedom, wonderful mobility. But can it be sustained? If we're coming to a period when the production of petroleum begins to decline worldwide. Oh, they're discovering more. They're producing more in the Soviet Union. It went down. It's coming back, and so on. I invite you to study this and to look at it and understand petroleum, fossil fuels, coal, the rest is a non-renewable resource. When that resource is gone, what do? Solar, wind power, hydrogen, these other things. Our national policy now is find the remaining natural gas and get it out. Bring it out so we won't have shortages. That's what our policy is. And our policy, stupid as it was pushed by the big oil companies. I administered it for 8 years. I ought to know about it. The national policy was restrict imports of cheap oil from other countries. They were ready, Venezuela and Mexico, the others, they had surpluses. We restricted it to 20%. And after some of us watched it, we said, well, what it really is a drain America first policy. Use our oil first. Hold out this cheap oil. Well, this is where it's taken us. So I've set the stage, and now, Dean, you like my message. What should we do? I'm trying to put the pieces together in my mind, and I'm not there yet, so I'm not going to give you my big solution. But there was only one solution to this crisis. We could turn back the experts that I listen to in global warming. We could reduce the production of these gases if we would change our automobile fleet and we would help other countries. There are a lot of things that can be done that I'm not an expert in, but I know that conservation and thrift and having efficiency. What's wrong with being efficient? You don't even hear the word thrift anymore. Teddy Roosevelt used to talk about it all the time, thrift. What we're going to have to cope with this new world we're rushing unprepared into is a design revolution. The design of cities, which, how did Los Angeles happen? Did it happen by design? Hell, the real estate people made it happen. What's happening in Phoenix? Go look. The same thing. We're going to have more compact cities, urban planning, architectural design of cities, buildings. We're going to have to, all kinds of buildings are going to have to be designed to be energy efficient. That will be the main criterion. Transportation, efficiency. Amory Lovins says, and he's probably correct, we could have, it would be an abrupt turn and shocking to us, we could have smaller, lighter cars that would get 80 miles per gallon. 80 miles per gallon. We wouldn't move as fast, we wouldn't move as much, but we could preserve our automobile culture much longer than we're going to the direction that we're headed now. So design and efficient automobiles. Design of buildings. One of the things that pleased me here across the street was to see that New Orleans has preserved its trolley system. What a wonderful, cultivated thing to do. You know, there are examples. 30 years ago, San Francisco put in its rapid transit system. It saved the community, reduced the number of automobiles that were needed and that travel. Los Angeles didn't, by the way. They thought of it 10 years ago and it was too late. Those sprawl cities or disaster areas waiting to happen when this crunch comes. But design of transportation systems, bringing back light rail, bringing back trains. Washington, if it didn't have its subway system, would be choked to death. Today, New Orleans is fortunate. Well, I didn't go looking for sprawl. I'm sure you have some. But in terms of your transportation system, in terms of your buildings and so on, in terms of your climate, this balmy, wonderful climate you have here for 10 months a year is a marvel. And you will feel less pressure, but that doesn't mean I'm saying don't begin to work, don't get busy doing something. I believe I said that a wonderful scientist sat with me on the plane when I traveled around. First time I'd ever seen the coastal area and the big problems you have here. And we talked and I asked questions and so on. And he convinced me, if I wasn't already convinced, that the key to saving what can be saved of the coastal zone of Louisiana is science. Not having a pork barrel of projects the way it's been done and do most of the decisions made about the Mississippi River have been dumb, D-U-M-B. There are a lot, if you listen to what the scientists say, you can begin to make good decisions. The scientists are trying to tell us something about global warming. Energy experts, some of them alarming, not enough, are saying that we're headed for cataclysm if we don't reduce the burning of fossil fuels by efficiency. Let me ask a question. I'm going to take questions in a minute. I'm about talked out here. What is the most, in terms of the lives of all of you here, of people, the most important invention in the last 150 years? Not the computer, not the airplane, electricity. The production and transmission of electricity affects the lives of everyone, doesn't it? And so I'm dumping a heavy load here, and I deliberately told Nick I want to take questions because some of you may want to argue with me, some of you may want to throw me softballs or support my point of view. But I believe there are ominous signs, there are clouds on the horizon that say that we ought to act, that the United States must be the world leader, that we need statesmanship to tackle these two big problems that in some ways overlap, by the way. You can see the overlaps. I don't have to tell you about it. So that is my visionary message. And I'm glad to see a full house, and I hope you go home and think about these things. Thank you.